really young kid, I thought, so my father was in the Yiddish theater, and then he stopped because there was a war. I mean, I had these ideas of how the world worked, and I thought there was this secret council in Berlin where they decided my father wasn't very good, and they had to invade Poland.
He's a Genie Award-winning actor who has starred in Academy Award-winning motion pictures like Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven, television series like Frasier and Warehouse 13, and he's performed, directed, and written for the stage. Canadian-born Saul Rubinek's been a working actor for over 5 decades. We met him at Fedora's restaurant in New York City. Saul, you have said that...
No, I didn't.
Yeah, you did. You said acting doesn't choose you. You don't choose acting. Acting chooses you.
Well, if you're lucky.
In your case,
yeah.
It's almost as if it got chosen for you before you were even born. Your father did acting.
Well, I always felt that the Second World War was Hitler's way of telling my father he didn't want him to do Yiddish theater.
But he was doing Yiddish theater.
Well,
right?
yeah, I know, but he put a stop to that pretty quick. When I was a really young kid, I thought, so my father was in the Yiddish theater, and then he stopped because there was a war. I mean, I had these ideas of how the world worked, and I thought there was this secret council in Berlin where they decided my father wasn't very good, and they had to invade Poland. I don't know.
Well, it's a theory.
Better reason than the one he had. There's, yeah, I guess in some ways it was meant to be. I guess I'm talking about the fact that when you follow your heart, if you have no choice, you know, if your general is called No Choice, if that's the name of your general, then look, why choose a profession in the arts if you can help it? It's you know,
good point.
It's ridiculously hard to make a living. You're constantly vulnerable to the horrors of rejections on a daily basis, especially when you're young. And if you haven't already, if you're older, you've already either given it up or you're not rejected as often because you stay away from those people, if you can. But it's a very, very hard way to make a living, but it's been a joyous one. And when, I talk various places, and I teach a course, and we can talk about what course, and I meet young people who want to be involved in this, and they ask for my advice. I wrote a play called Terrible Advice, and that tells you what I think about advice. I just think that it does have to choose you.
Yeah.
Because
but you were what? You were five or six when you started.
All that happened to me was that I was an immigrant kid. I spoke Yiddish and French, well, kind of street French in Montreal, and in a working class area of Montreal, Clark Street, between Montreal and Villeneuve, and I went to a Parrots Shula, which was partly English, partly Yiddish, and my father got a job out of he was working as a presser and in a factory in Montreal, after having been kind of a big name in the displaced persons camp where he was directing and acting. But yeah, a little baby, I was 10 months old or something, and he had to make a living, and he got a job in Ottawa. And made him a little bit more money. And when we moved to Ottawa, it was like I was on Mars, because here I was going to a school that was half Yiddish, you know, mostly, and I spoke Yiddish on the streets in French, and I was now living in Sandy Hill, and in Ottawa, and it was really bizarre. And there was this kid living in downstairs, Bobby Dermer. Bobby was maybe a year older than me, or 2 years older, so I was probably 6 and he was probably 8. And Bobby was working in amateur theater at the Ottawa Little Theatre, which is probably the oldest amateur theater in Canada, and doing children's theater. And I was in love with Bobby Dermer, just the way a 6-year-old would be in love with an 8-year-old. He was funny, and he was acrobatic, and he was outgoing, and I just wanted to do everything he wanted to do. And I went to see, I think we went to see, I have vague memories of him, with a really tall guy called Bill Glenn, who eventually ended up doing television in Hollywood. But Bill Glenn, who was 6'4", and Bobby, who was, you know, 4 foot nothing, or whatever he was, and they used to do stuff before the shows, you know.
You mean to warm up the audience?
Yeah, to warm up the audience. Right. They used to, in kind of Harlequin kind of stuff. And because I was also having trouble at school, I was getting pushed around, and I was pushing back because I grew up in kind of a rough area of given the French-Canadian kids and the Jewish kids and all this, there's a lot of anti-Semitism, casual 5-year-old anti-Semitism, and I had to, defend myself at 5. And when people said the wrong thing to me in Ottawa, I had to lay them out. And I got into a lot of trouble. I was violent. And my father and mother would never have occurred to them that I'd need counseling. My father just said, well, there's a drama school, and let him go there.
Vent there.
And there was this, you just tell me to shut up anytime.
Go ahead, keep going.
There were these wonderful women, Barbara Meikle-John and Faith Ward, who, as I recall, I'm not sure if both their husbands worked for the British High Commission, but they found themselves in a rather provincial place. And they were both graduates of RADA. Wonderful women. I mean, extraordinary women. And they taught both to teenagers and to little kids. And when I remember going into a class run by Faith Ward, I was probably 7. And the first thing that was going on was an improvisation role. These kids were just improvising. Of course, there were no boys, because it was a really queer thing. If you were a boy in a drama class, you were, not that I knew anything about that, but I just knew there were just a lot of girls. Like, I mean, I'm talking about 15 girls and 2 boys, 3 boys at the most. And we were set off into groups. And I remember being put into a group, and I didn't know what anybody was doing, but I realized that they were trying to tell a story. And I was filled with stories, and I remember immediately taking over and and everybody just listening to me, and I had this story. And so it wasn't so much about acting, funnily enough, or performing. It was that I really could tell a story. My father was a great storyteller. I loved telling stories. I loved stories about, any kind of story. I liked making stories up. I still do. None of this is true. So, so then
oh, we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah. So then it was like I had gills, and somebody had thrown me in water, and I didn't know that I had gills until somebody threw me in water. And that's how it chose me. And every Saturday morning, I would go there, every Saturday morning, first with my parents taking me in, and later on, by 10 years old, I was going on my own, and by bus, or streetcar, to Rideau Street, to the Owl Theater. And I started, and there were so few boys, I got put into these productions immediately.
Your very first mentor, John Palmer.
Yeah, but not until I was in. My first mentor was Bobby Dermer.
Okay.
Really wasn't.
Okay, I suppose.
So I was crazy about him. I just wanted to do everything he wanted to do, or that he did. Not until I was in college. Not until John Palmer is 5 years older than me, so he was born in '43, in May of '43, and so when I was 8, he was 13,
yep.
And we did a production of Heidi together, along with another person who teaches at, she's teaching at George Brown right now. She's a great teacher, Nika Rilski. And Nika, also from Ottawa. And Nika was in Heidi, and John Palmer was in Heidi, and I played Seppi the urchin boy. My pants fell down right in front of everybody. I didn't know they had it.
Now here's what I got a quote from John about you guys performing at that age, at the Little Theater.
He was talking about Treasure Island.
He said, so I was about 12, he was about 8, and yet here he was telling everybody what to do. No, don't you move there, you move over here. So naturally, he was downstage center, It was very funny.
What's better? Well,
and he said, that's typical. Saul is a dictator, We had a lot of arguments over theater, but we're still very good friends. But working with him is something else.
But he can't forget what it was like when I was 8, I guess. My memory of that is a little different.
Of course.
I don't think I started telling people to do it until I was 9. So he's wrong about that. I was 8. Couldn't have been anything like that. I have no memory of any of that. I do know that I was playing. He's talking about Jim Hawkins, and I really believed that I was Jim Hawkins, and it was.
This is the Treasure Island, Jim Hawkins.
Yeah, it was an amateur children's show that we did every Saturday in different high schools, and I was really in it. I mean, I really loved all those stories. I really believed that I was that kid. And we had to run, I had to, at one point at the end of Act 1, I remember having to run downstage center. One hand was being held by, Dr. Livesley, and the other hand was being held by Squire Trelawney, which was John Palmer. And I had to run downstage and look out to a sea of audience. I mean, who would have the balls to do this today? And look out at them and go, shall we sail to Treasure Island? Now, today they just tell you to go fuck yourself. But then, you've got this resounding yes, So, listen, if I could get a resounding yes from 500 9-year-olds, I earned the right to tell John Palmer what the hell to do.
You and he went to New York at one point to see some musicals, and he's talked about. I mean, you've talked to me about this before too, but he also talked to me about the impact that trip had on both of you in terms of what you saw there.
John Palmer and I never were in New York together seeing any musicals.
Really?
No, he's got that wrong. John Palmer convinced me, though, in December of 1965 to go see the Morass Sad, and that did have an influence on me. Peter Brook's Morass Sad was playing in New York. It's actually on again right now in London at the Aldwych. Not the Aldwych, at Stratford. But that production of the persecution and assassination of Marat, performed by the inmates of Charenton under the direction of Marquis de Sade, that's the full title, shortened to Marat/Sade, was one of the most seminal productions in the history of 20th century English theater. And Peter Brook being one of the most extraordinary theater geniuses to come out of the 20th century and influenced many, many people, including 17-year-old me and certainly 22-year-old John Palmer. That's that. That was one thing, and that's one of the reasons I ended up in England after a year at Carleton. I mean, I had an idea that I would join the Royal Shakespeare Company. I didn't. But what happened, what he's talking about, if you really want to know,
I do,
is that when I was 14, I came to my parents to New York. I did see, somewhere around then, I did see something that really affected me deeply, although it affected me deeply, but I don't know how it played out in my life. It doesn't seem to have. I happened to be lucky enough to see both Louis Armstrong and Pearl Bailey do Hello, Dolly on Broadway. So I saw a black production of that with Louis Armstrong and Pearl Bailey. That was pretty amazing.
I bet.
But the thing that really affected me when I was 14 or 15 was, nothing, John wasn't there. I saw a production of a play by a playwright called Murray Shisgle, of a play called Love, L-U-V, that starred 3 people, 2 of whom I ended up working with. They played my parents a number of years later, but one was Eli Wallach and one was Ann Jackson. The other extraordinary actor was Alan Arkin. This was a play, and the other person I ended up working with was Murray Shisgle. And I said to Murray, about 35 years ago, your play Love, it changed my life. He said, how could a teenager's life be changed by middle-aged New Yorkers? A story about love and materialism and sex and middle-aged New Yorkers. How the hell? I said, well, okay, to be honest with you, it wasn't the play. It was the intermission.
Explain that.
And he said, what? Being deliberately provocative. But it was the intermission that changed my life. The intermission, I saw this play, I didn't really understand it very well, but it was funny, and they were really great actors. But I remember an intermission, I was with my mom and dad, and we were in the bar, I was getting the Coke and something, and all the people around me, everywhere, spoke exactly the same as the people on stage. Now, that had been experienced in the 15th century in London. That had been experienced in the 1920s in Chicago when Ben Hecht wrote The Front Page. That also was happening in 1963 in New York, but I'd never seen it. All I saw was British and American accents and an intermission where everybody spoke a completely different language. Because we had no Canadian playwrights, or if we did, they were far and few between, certainly not celebrated, and certainly not anything a boy in Ottawa would see.
Did he appreciate what a revelation that was to you? Because
Sure.
to him that would be, it would seem normal, right?
He's
that
a playwright.
Yeah.
Of course,
Okay.
of course he understood it. He understood it immediately because he was writing for the audience that was in the theater.
Right.
When did we write for the audience that was in the theater? Who was doing that? Not anybody I'd ever met. One of the first people I'd ever met who did that was this kid who was in Heidi with me, called John Palmer. And John Palmer was the one, as a playwright, and he was one of hundreds that were of his age range, starting in somewhere around the 60s, mid-60s, towards the late 60s. This was the revolution that was happening, aided and abetted by the fact that we got lucky enough to have Trudeau as a liberal government that was going to subsidize this, and had local initiative LIP grants, yes, and opportunities for youth grants, and those grants and the formation of those theaters across the country that had as part of their mandate, they had to produce new original plays, much as this show is in existence because the commission insists that the people that are showing Parliament have to have some original Canadian programming in order to have their license, so we're able to talk. In the same way, those theaters were built in those days, and as a result, I'm sitting here talking about my career.
You know, what's interesting about that, and you talk about that being a revelation to you, you go to England, you're there for a while, you come back, you get a good, steady, for the time, well-paying job at Stratford, and then you walked away from it. Talk about that, and why you did that.
Well, I got into it on a dare anyway. I mean, as far as I remember, I crashed the auditions to get into Stratford on a dare by Cedric Smith, who I was visiting at the time.
Cedric Smith?
And I was...
First County Conspiracy.
And I was already... I performed in Stratford at the Black Swan Coffee House doing original Canadian work. And I didn't know what to do with myself. And Cedric dared me to crash the auditions. I got in by... I don't think I did any Shakespeare. And Jean Gascon just loved... I just entertained him. I sang some songs and told some jokes and did some Jules Pfeiffer routines that I had done at Carleton, and part of a Jules Pfeiffer review that I had done, and also that I repeated and had directed at Sir George Williams in 1 year there. And so getting in on a kind of dare... Look, I was at Stratford in the regime of John Hirsch and Jean Gascon, who did not like each other. Jean Gascon, a robust, heterosexual, larger-than-life, extraordinary man of the theater. John Hirsch, a neurotic, gay, Holocaust survivor with a brilliant analytical mind. These people were meant to be at war with each other, and they were. And the survivor, I don't remember. I think one of the reasons that Des McAnuff, for example, is an artistic director there now is because John Hirsch groomed him from a very young age and saw his talent and knew that that guy would eventually run Stratford. Des will tell you the same thing. But I was caught between these two giants as a 20-year-old, and I, with a lot of energy, and 5'6" and not built for those costumes, and that mid-Atlantic accent, and whatever I did was going to... I remember John cast me in a production of Satyricon that he was doing, that he was hoping to take to New York because I could sing, and Jean Gascon hated him and immediately put me into Tartuffe as the silent role of Laurent. Now, once I saw the politics of how that operated, I was looking for a way out. And although in those days I was 20 years old, and I was on tour making $225 a week. That's like making $2,000 now. Listen, here's why. For $2,000 cash, I bought a Fiat 850, brand new 1969. That's what it cost for a brand new 69 Fiat 850, and I bought it for cash. And I was making $160 a week, for 11 months as a 20-year-old. That's certainly over $1,000 a week. And I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't need it. I didn't care about it. I just wanted to do something, and what was I doing? News, my good lord, from France. News, my good lord, from France. And what the fuck am I going to do with that? So on all the costumes that they were putting me in, I could see that they were grooming me for the role of Osric. Well, man, you know, what exactly, who the hell is Osric, right? The guy who says, a hit, a palpable hit, when Laertes and Hamlet are sword fighting. So once you see what you're being groomed for, and once you understand what you're understudying, and once you see the culture of a place, I wasn't a spring chicken. I'd already been working, I'd already been rejected from every drama school in England when I was 18. That's why I didn't stay in England, because I auditioned for them all. Couldn't get in. I ended up a busker on the street. I'd already been at Café Le Hibou. I'd done Duchess of Malfi. I did the Canadian premiere of Wojciech as a co-director and playing Wojciech. I'd already you know, done some classics. I'd already done a lot of new plays. I was in competition with the Stratford Festival, and I was at the Shaw Festival doing one-man show of Diary of a Madman, which I helped co-adapt. I did 2 or 3 original plays by John. I had spent my life
by the age of 20. We're talking.
Yes, and so I already. So what the hell was I going to stay at Stratford for? There was no reason for me to stay at Stratford. And then we went to the Hole. Do you know what the Hole is?
No.
It was known for years as the Hole. It's called the National Arts Center now. And the reason it was a hole is because they never had the money to get it. And it was called a hole because it was a hole in the ground. Now, the first year that it was built was 1970, that anybody put anything in there. And I was there. And there was a young company put in there, directed by an old friend of mine, Tim Bond, a wonderful director, who, and we had a little company, Guy Bannerman, myself, Lou Bagoy. We did some really interesting work. But you know, it wasn't going to last, and I was going to have to go back to Stratford and be as cast and make the money. And when you're 21 at that point, you know, so I didn't go back. Wasn't interested. Instead, and my parents were beside themselves. There was this little theater that was just starting up in Toronto called Theatre Passe-Muraille, which was an offshoot of Rochdale College. And John had a friend who was working there, Martin Kinch, that he knew from various programs that the Ontario government had operated in the late 60s to send directors to England as apprentices and stuff. And Martin was directing there, and John wanted to direct there, and I just moved to Toronto. You know, I had very little money, but who needed it? And they were doing really exciting work. So my father was really upset because he could tell his friends that his son was at Stratford. Now he was at this dirty hippie theater making less than $10 a week. God knows what kind of drugs were being done there. But it took him years. He did understand eventually, because listen, he had broken away from a Hasidic tradition, cut off his payas to become an actor in Yiddish theater when it was verboten. So he had some affinity towards that kind of rebellion. And for me, it wasn't rebellion. I was just going to where life was exciting. It wasn't like a choice. It was no choice. It was where the action was. What I realized was that this was where that 14-year-old Saul had seen the lobby of people speaking their own language. This is where we could do it. And even though half the people were stoned all the time, and there were amazing, amazing talents there. There was Jim Gerard, there was Paul Thompson, who is the equivalent of knighted now, I think, in Canada, and he deserves to be, who was creating improvisational work, going, the farm show, and I did 2 shows with him that were done that way, and John was creating a new improvisational style, which I eventually used to write the play I just did that was in London, and I was learning at an exponential and extraordinary rate. And it was, on whatever experience I had, it's true, I was kind of more experienced than many of my contemporaries that were there. But certainly what I was attracted to and what I got from them was passion and commitment and bravery, because they were willing to go out there. They were willing to do stuff in the nude. They were willing to, literally and figuratively, they were undressing. They were willing to talk about the Doukhobors, the farm community. They were willing to talk about, we did a show called Manson, okay, a musical called Manson in 1971. In 1969 and 70, the picture of Charles Manson, people may not know this, the picture of Charles Manson was on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine as a hero, as a counterculture hero, railroaded by a right-wing, piggish FBI. And community that we were in at Theatre Passe Muraille was certainly susceptible to that kind of left-wing bullshit. And we were all pretty left-wing, but that kind of left-wing bullshit was prevalent. Now, John Palmer directs a musical about how Manson, mesmerizing, brilliantly played by an actor called Peter Jobin, and he mesmerized the crowd, but certainly was a murderer and created a cult. And we turned that audience. That audience was ready to accept him as a hero who had been, you know, framed. And certainly it would have played right into the bullshit attitude of that audience. Instead, this is the brilliance of John Palmer and his collaborators. I was just an actor. I had nothing to do with creating the whole work, but I was a part of it, very proud of it too. A young Urjo Correda, who was writing for the Toronto Star and made his career articulating the emergence of that theater scene, gave that a rave review. I'll never forget that.
If theater is, I mean, your passion for the theater for so many years, from such a young age onwards, at what point then, well, that's not the way to phrase this question. Is it an inevitability for any actor that who is so passionate about the theater that ultimately you're going to end up doing film, television? You're going to go the other.
There's no generality, but I would be, you know, you should shoot me if I start to generalize about shit like that. I have no idea what's generally true for people. I really don't, man. I mean, I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of people who stay in theater, who love theater. I mean, look at Mark Rylance, probably the best, the most important actor of his generation right now in London and New York, and who was an artistic director of, was a director at the Donmar, was an artistic director of the Restored Globe Theatre, and who's done originated some extraordinary roles. I mean, he's not doing, as far as I know, he's not doing much television.
At what point did you start doing that? How old were you when you started doing it?
Well, John Hirsch came to CBC in 1973. I did a production of The Dybbuk in Winnipeg with him, and he told me he was going to take over the drama department at CBC. Well, hallelujah. John Hirsch, brilliant mind, and who knew the theater scene, was going to take over drama. Well, he got rid of a lot of deadwood. And immediately the doors were open. We couldn't get in. Those of us that were in Theatre Passe Muraille, Factory Lab Theatre, and Tarragon Theatre in 1971, 72, couldn't get into CBC. You know, the casting directors, the culture was closed to us. We were not going to get in. John Hirsch immediately started to, first of all, he created a whole new series of work. So people like Claude Jutra and Frank Vitale and independent filmmakers from Montreal all across the country suddenly were in an anthology series. Martin Short was on TV for the first time with me in a thing written by Louis Del Grande and about, for the very first time, gay characters. I played probably the first gay character that was very interesting because I had so many friends who were gay, but they were, many of them, closeted. And in those days, in the 60s and early 70s, there was no work about, it wasn't okay, you know. I did a play in New York in 75 that John directed that was in a place called the West Side Discussion Group. They didn't have the balls to call themselves the West Side Gay Theater. You know, it's pre-AIDS we're talking about, and it was Gay Lib, it was called in those days. And that was certainly true in Toronto. But there was a character I played twice. I played two gay characters. One, the only problem with the character was that he didn't have the balls to come out. That was a new thing for CBC in 1976, I can tell you that. And that's John Hirsch, a gay man, and certainly not hiding it, who was running the drama department, and an extremely brilliant, open-minded individual who changed the face of Canadian drama by being appointed. Not without difficulty. People loathed him. He was a very difficult guy, but he was an extraordinary mind and heart. And the reason I started working in television is because those doors got opened. So naturally, those of us that were in the theater, getting a chance to be on TV, well, why not? Mm-hmm. I mean, we were doing new stuff with really interesting independent filmmakers, certainly far more interesting than the movies were being done. I'm not talking about the filmmakers like Don Shabib and those great filmmakers that were, I'm talking about, for the most part, the bullshit American work that was coming up, that was tax dollar write-off crap that was being done with has-been American stars that were, you know, that were coming and being overpaid in Canada.
And that was the tax shelter era, too,
It
right?
was, and so the great work was being done on television. the great work was being done on television. Of course, we flocked to it.
How did you, was there an adjustment from theater to that in terms of your craft?
I was sitting I was doing theater where people were this close to me. I wasn't, emoting at Stratford. I was in 200-seat theater, 100-seat theater. I did one-man shows where sometimes one person showed up.
Really?
Yeah, I did one of those. That guy couldn't leave easily.
So when they said one-man show,
he meant the audience.
Meant the audience.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. All right.
No, it wasn't a huge adjustment. It was a big learning adjustment because I didn't know how the cameras worked and I didn't understand editing worked, and I got brought into an editing room by Claude Jutro. I got taught. I was, the first time I was ever a leading role for Claude Jutro, he also brought me in to the editing room as an assistant to the assistant editor so I could learn. And it was only I didn't realize he was really teaching me about directing, because you can't direct without learning how to without being in an editing room, but or at least not well. And he had a secret agenda, but I was also learning about film acting, and you only learn about that by understanding how, at least my brain. Many actors don't care, and they don't need to, and they're far more talented than I am, and they're brilliant actors, and they didn't go the same route at all. So there's no rules.
Yeah. I want to get you to tell me an anecdote, because this is a good one, and I've heard you say this before, but I want you to repeat it, because the first feature film that you were in was a movie, I think, called The Agency. Was it called The Agency, something like that? And it was,
Agency.
Yeah, and Robert Mitchum was in it.
Robert Mitchum was certainly a hero of mine, and my very first feature. Now, I had already done television in far more interesting scripts than Agency, and I'd done challenging work on television on CBC with great directors. And George Katzenzer was a good director, and it was the second movie ever produced by Robert Lantos. He had just done In Praise of Older Women. Very good film, actually.
Yes,
Agency was a piece of shit script, and it was Lee Majors, who was trying to get a feature career. How he was trying to get a feature career after a $6 Million Man by deciding to do Piranha, and then afterwards Agency. And Agency was not a good script, but it had a great role in it for my character, probably the only well-written character called Goldstein, who ends up dead. It was a film about subliminal advertising, and Robert Mitchum was a bad guy. And the first time I met him, I was really, I was very nervous. And Robert Mitchum, man. So he was sitting there and he was working on his script, and I thought to myself, he was about my age. I'm 63 now. He was about that in 1979, and he was working on his script, and I thought, look at that. Terrible script. There's nothing to work on, but there he is, diligently working on his script. Kind of awesome. So I kind of sidled over. I thought I'd introduce myself and kind of looked over what he was doing. And he was writing right across the page. He was writing N-A-R. And he'd read the next page very carefully. And then he wrote the same thing, N-A-R. And I didn't even introduce myself. What are you doing? And he said, no acting required. and then he said, who are you? And I said, I'm Saul Rubinek. I'm playing the role of Goldstein. This is what he said. I'll never forget it. You're playing Goldstein? I said, yeah. He said, you do realize that is the only fucking role worth playing in this movie. And if you're not the best thing in this movie, if I were you, I'd quit the business. And I said, Mr. Mitchum, I will be the best thing in this movie.
And were you?
And he said, I like you. What's your name? What's your name? And he was awesome. He was really awesome.
Tell me about the. You've talked often in other interviews about how important it is for you to have other projects as well as your acting.
Oh my God! I'd be on the ground, some liquid mess of vibrating nerves if I didn't have 15 things on the go. Look, actors are they're screwed unless they're waiting for this to ring. Even before this existed, they'd have to be near a payphone or their agent. You're constant. You're an independently contracted, thing that can only work when somebody creates something around you. You act in your living room. So that's why actors go to classes and they go to, you know, wherever they can to keep their muscles limber and their. But no, so I started really young going, I can't live like this. I can't. First of all, I didn't start that way. I had no agent until I was already working for 1973, I was 25, so 17 years on
without
stage.
an agent?
Sure, because
Yeah.
I was on stage doing both amateur, semi-professional, my own work, created my own work. I didn't need an agent. And so not until, you know, I was about 25 or so. And then that's only because I got a job at CBC, or I may have gotten a job at one of the regional theaters where I didn't have any idea how much I was supposed to be paid. And I realized pretty quick that there's no way that I could live this way. I had to have projects. And as I grew older, I started to write, and I, you know, had projects that I wanted to direct and write and produce, and I knew that they could heat up. This could heat up, and this one had to be on the back burner, because if this somehow fell away, I didn't want my world to fall apart. So I was always creating a lot of different projects, usually with friends, and that I like to work with, and I realized young that nothing goes to waste. No, nothing is. Things that fall apart, completely fall apart, will rise like a phoenix at the right time in the right place, and that's really been a big part of my life. You know, that those things, that idea I had in 1980, it's just come alive right now. And in fact, it just got produced in London. That other idea I had with so-and-so, I think now is the time to do it. And I've got it in a drawer. Well, in this case, it's on a file in my desk, you know, and I'm able to do. And that keeps me from, and it always has, kept me from ruminating or becoming bitter about not getting this or that job that I think I've earned. And it's bitterness that I saw quick. I saw pretty quick that it was bitterness that was the thing that destroyed the people. That was the attrition. It was bitterness, and the inability, and plus the inability to get up after rejection. So here I saw geniuses, incredibly talented people, writers, directors, painters, dancers, all these extraordinary people fall by the wayside. Now, of course, sometimes your grand piano comes and hits you on the head. You're ill, you know, or literally hit by a car.
Right.
But I'm talking about the grand piano that's made out of despair.
Yeah.
And that despair I saw around me. I said, how am I going to prevent this? Because why is that extraordinary human being, why aren't they working? Why are they so angry? Why are they so, and they're 28 years old, or 30, or 50, and I thought to myself, if that can happen to that person who's so much more talented than me, then how the hell am I going to survive? So I thought, well, how do I prevent bitterness? I guess by, the first way I prevented it was getting the fuck out of Canada. I love Canada, and I go back and I work there all the time. So I'm saying that to be provocative, but let me explain. By the time I was 27 years old, 28, I had done 9 leading roles on the CBC, and I got told that there wasn't, that was that.
Your time is up.
Yes, well, it was government.
Make room for somebody else.
Yes, well, it seemed a fair thing to do. It's a government organization paid for by tax dollars. Why should you get all the leading roles? I agreed. I thought, you're right. Why should I? Absolutely right. You know, and I thought to myself, I will be lucky to be paying rent in somebody's basement, auditioning for roles only if the character's named Saul. I wasn't far off from the truth in my mind. And I thought, and what will destroy me is not that.
Yeah.
That won't destroy me. It is feeling entitled to something better that I didn't get, that is owed to me by the country. The country doesn't owe me anything. It gave my parents and me a life. It took us in when we were immigrants, and it gave me my start, and the government subsidized the theaters I started. So when I say fucking Canada, I mean this. I don't mean it that way. I mean that I hit a glass ceiling and I left. But when I left, unlike this generation, when I left, I was called a traitor. When I left, I was called a commercial, I was called a whore. I thought, yeah, man, let me spread my legs then, exploit me.
This was coming from people that were friends of yours, I'm assuming.
Well, I don't know about friends, but certainly my colleagues.
Yeah.
It was going to New York or going to Hollywood was like turning my back on the culture, on a Canadian culture, on Canadian plays. You know, this phrase kept hitting me over and over again, that poverty loves to cloak itself in holiness. There are some real problems with the establishment and fat cats, but man, poverty, left-wing poverty, there's nothing like it for entitled bullshit. So I was, you know, a part of that culture, and I was considered a traitor. It didn't bother me. And I went to New York, and I luckily was friends with Des McAnuff, who had started in the same theater that I was working in, and gave me my first job in the 70s, and I took off. And as a result, and I made a promise to myself, look, when I saw movies being done in Canada, American movies I'm talking about, not Canadian movies, I saw the best actors of my generation being mistreated, underpaid, and on American films, and I swore to myself, I said, well, there's a perfect recipe to be, you know, a screwed up and bitter person. Not that some of those actors weren't, but I knew myself what I would be. And I said, I'm never, ever going to work on an American film in Canada as a Canadian. I will only work on an American television show or an American film in Canada as an American. In order to do that, I have to have an American career. So I went and got one. Because I didn't want to fall by the sword of embitterment.
How hard was it in the beginning, getting roles going? I mean, you were still going to auditions. Tell me what that whole process was like.
I was staying 1 block from here, crashing at Gail Garnett's place. I was living in New York on $3 a day in 1977. I had 9 leads or something on CBC, but I couldn't show them to an agent. You know why? Nobody had a VCR machine in their office yet. That was the year that people got a VCR machine. You had to have a 3/4-inch tape, and you had to go rent a room. How could I show an agent my work? So that year was very difficult. Ken Welsh, who had played Hamlet at Stratford when he was 25, was now working in New York as of quite established. And we were friends. We were certainly acquaintances. A great guy. And he introduced me to his agent, Marilyn Zapmary, wonderful woman. And she saw my work and she took me on. That's the trick, right? I also got a green card because I got a green card before I left. I know I wasn't coming here like an idiot. I'd already come here like an idiot in '68 and, you know, realized there was not a chance I was going to do anything at 20. That's why I ended up at Stratford. But I didn't have a green card and I didn't have an agent. But once I had all this work behind me and I got an agent and a green card, it was just a question of time. I didn't have a family. I didn't have kids yet. I didn't have, you know, did I have a mortgage? Not yet. And I could crash somebody's apartment and I could live on $3-4 a day.
That's the time to do it, right? That's when you have to do it.
As soon as I got a job, as I was walking here, thinking of the irony that you were interviewing me, as I was passing by the Riviera and these places, that I was about to get a job in as a waiter in 1977. Just as I was falling completely out of money, I'd get a job back. Claude Dutra would get me a job back in Toronto, and I'd get another CBC job, even though they'd sworn that they wouldn't work. Well, of course I knew why I was working in Toronto. I had a New York address. Plus ça change. Plus c'est la même chose. So I kept getting work, and my writing and my directing got put on hold because I didn't stop work. I mean, I got turned down for a lot of stuff, but I didn't stop working until, well, for another, I don't think I was out of work for 18 years after that. I mean,
really?
No.
Wow.
I don't think I was ever out of work. Because if I didn't get a job, I make my own job.
Right.
You understand? I didn't sit around and wait for it. You asked me that earlier.
So it wasn't a matter of not
of getting every audition that you went
Oh my
to.
God.
You were turned down a lot, I'm assuming. Or that, yeah.
Yes, if you're an actor, that's your life.
But you knew how to do it, though. You knew how to.
I don't know. I didn't think about it like that. I was part of a community, American actors, New York actors who, I mean, I was a Toronto actor, then I was a New York, Toronto actor, and then I became a New York, Toronto, Los Angeles actor, and then I got married, and then my wife was pregnant, and then I said, well, I can't do theater easily anymore. So I stopped doing theater because I couldn't support family and a mortgage by doing plays, because I realized for myself, not everybody does, and they don't have to think like I do, but I was doing a Canadian play in New York, directed. It was really funny. Chris Grabowski was the assistant director of that play, and when my daughter, who's now 20, was looking for colleges to go in, at the college that my daughter ended up, Chris Grabowski was in charge of the drama department. It's really funny. But Chris Grabowski was the assistant director to this play by Walker called Love and Anger that I was doing here off Broadway. And
this is George Walker.
George Walker's play, and I found out Eleanor was pregnant. It's 21 years ago, and I thought to myself, okay, great, but if I do plays now, that'll just be for me, right? And the reason I'm married and have a family is because I realize that, it's not all about being first anymore. I mean, enough of that. And now I could put that idea of whatever I had in my head aside and without feeling like I was betraying some, destiny. And I wanted a family, and I'm incredibly lucky. So theater, stopped being a part of my life. But it had been. I was now 42. It had been for 35 years, up until that day. So it was okay.
Tell me about the collaboration between and the support system between you and your wife, who have worked together on a number of occasions. How important is that to you?
It's about one of the most important things that's in my life. I mean, Eleanor and I are partners in our lives as husband and wife, and also as parents. That's the first thing. And Eleanor happens to be a brilliant producer, and she taught. She was educated at U of T, but really taught by Ralph Zimmerman, who's a great agent and still my agent. And he represents a lot of the great playwrights in Canada. And she worked for him. That's how I met. And she read everything. She's really brilliant at script development, and has remained so. And many of the projects that we have together are either developed or even co-written by Eleanor. And
what's that like? I'm curious about that though, because at times you must be at loggerheads over certain aspects of different projects.
Well, sparks are there. Sparks are a good thing. They're there they create light, and they're there to illuminate. Friction creates sparks. Sparks can illuminate and set fire to things, and that's okay. They can also burn things down. So it's up to the people that have the friction, creative friction, to figure out a way to turn, lemons into lemonade, or bad situations into good ones, and to figure out a way to do it. It doesn't always work, and it's difficult in marriages. But Eleanor put aside a lot of her career for a while to help raise the children, and so there was a decision that she made while she was doing other things, many other things, developing projects. So, but yeah, it's not easy. Like, marriage isn't easy. Neither is partnership, and not everybody goes in that direction or can. And we continue to work out the bumps, and that we find that the bumps are really are good. They smooth sailing can be really create banal work.
I want to ask you about this role that you're doing currently, the series Warehouse 13, which is now its third season.
Going into the fourth season.
And going into its fourth season, so obviously doing very well. But tell me the story, because since we were talking about auditions and so on, you have talked about the audition that you did for the role of the character that you're playing on that show, and it strikes me that it took very large balls to do what you did in the audition that you did.
I don't think so.
No?
Maybe for somebody else, but for me, it was really a question of, first of all, Why do you say that?
Because you walked in there and told them that the character that they had created wasn't really enough of a character.
Well, that wouldn't be balls. That would just be stupid. I mean, that would be arrogant and presumptuous, and it's not what I did.
Okay.
And that's a way. I mean, I really, yeah, it would be stupid. It's not balls. That's not what I did. What I did was I read a script that they didn't have, that they had tested. I knew that they had cast. There were 3 characters. 2 of them, the younger, prettier ones, had already been cast, and this older character was not cast. And that they had tried. They had screen tested a number of actors, and it hadn't worked for them. And that was the word. And that actors that were at my level of auditioning anyway knew that from their agents and managers and casting directors, and that wasn't hard information or intelligence to come by. So I knew already that was the case. They couldn't find anybody. So you read a script knowing that, I wonder why they can't find anybody for this role. So as I read the script, which was very imaginative and really well written, and I saw several writers on it, and I knew it had been developed over a number of years. I also knew that, look, I knew a lot of stuff before I read the script. Who was doing it, how it was done, how it was developed. And as I'm reading the script, knowing that they were interested in meeting me and me auditioning if I wanted to, I went, oh, I see why they can't cast this role. They haven't written it yet properly. They haven't decided. They haven't committed. This is a result of 4 or 5 different or 6 different writers, or 12 or 4, I didn't know how many, but I could feel it in this role. Not the other roles, but in this role it was like committed to this direction, countered and contradicted completely by this direction, but not on purpose. And I went, well, what would be interesting is if that contradiction existed on purpose, but it's not. It's because they're trying to have, it's because it's an amorphous mess, I thought. And I thought, okay, I can't play this. No one could. No one. I don't care how brilliant they are. And I've been in this situation before, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But I do not go to an audition in order to get a role.
Right.
Or let me put it this way. That was not well said. I don't go to an audition in order to get the job. I never have. I go to an audition because I want to play a role. If you want to get the job, it'll get in the way of the role. Getting the gig is not the thing.
So you'll do, in other words, you'll do what you think it's going to take to get that job.
No, you might do the wrong things because you're trying to please people.
Yeah.
Or you can't. I wanted to actually go to work, which is what I do when I go to a meeting or an audition. I'm interested in who am I working with? Do I want to work with them? Here's my ideas. Can they mitigate or change my ideas in such a way that excites me? I've got to be open-minded, right? Are they open-minded? And this is a commitment. It's not like doing an independent film for 4 weeks. This is a 6-year commitment. You sign a piece of paper before you do a screen test. They own you for 6 years before you do the screen test, which you're not necessarily going to do before you do the audition. You audition, they don't own you. But they will not let you do a screen test before they own you and have set the price. Why would they? You'd have them over a barrel if they choose you. So those are the way, that's how it happens. So I'm not going to go into a situation like that, especially one where my family is living in Los Angeles at the time, and I might have to be away if the series goes for a long time. I have to want to do it. So it wasn't, as you put it, like that.
Right, okay.
It was me looking as I would any role and going, here's what I would do to do it. And when I went into the room, I already knew Jace Alexander was directing it. I'd worked with Jace Alexander in Law & Order, and I knew what kind of director he was, really good. I knew that they were rebranding their network based on this series. I knew that they wanted a female audience, and this was an adventure show that needed humor. And I knew that I'm sitting here with a writer who's not a director, right? And I'm on video, and I said, or I don't even remember if I was on video. I might not have been. No, I wasn't on video. It was a one-on-one meeting with the writer, who was one of several writers who eventually took over, to be the sole writer of this project. I'm only answering this question in this detail because I don't want to give the wrong impression to anybody who's an actor sitting out there that this is some kind of, bravado. This is my life, and this is how I work. And I went into the room and I said, first of all, I want to congratulate you on the script, and it was really, and I talked about all the positive aspects of the script. And then I said, look, I don't mean to be presumptuous, but everybody out there that's sitting out there is brilliant. They're wonderful actors. You could throw a stone and cast this well. The problem isn't that that there aren't enough good actors. The problem is that even though so-and-so, and I knew the name of the actor who they had a pin in, who they were holding on to in case nobody else worked out. And we all know who that is. And he said, you do? I said, of course we do. All of us know what's going on. But the reason you can't cast it is, I think, and forgive me for being presumptuous, is that I don't think that the role has been, you're looking for somebody to make the role. It isn't in the writing yet. Some of it's there, but it's not there. And I think you want an actor to walk in and be the role. And they said, yeah, and it hasn't happened. He said, yeah, and it hasn't happened. I said, it hasn't happened. I think that, I don't know how other people would do this, but I certainly can leave. Don't have to go any further. But if you would allow me, I think I must take about 10% of this, or 15%, or occasionally 20%, and I have to fool around with it a little. And he said, in what way? And I said, well, why discuss it? I won't change the cues because there's somebody reading with me, so I won't screw them up. I won't change the last line of this, but I will play with the character. And I created a much darker character than they had written, a much more neurotic, more distracted, darker character, which interested me. They had written a much more, a character with much more largesse and welcoming, kind of a bon vivant, and I wasn't interested in playing that. It didn't interest me at all. It didn't fit for me. But who am I to say? I am the guy who's going to breathe life in it. That's who I am. And quite often, they're very nice in that situation. They don't get affronted. And after you leave the room, they might say, who the hell does he think he is? And sometimes, as in this situation, it was eureka. That's what we're missing. And when I did the screen test, that's what I did. And I ended up, so then they began to write for what I had injected into the role. So that's not balls, that's just somebody going to work.
We've run short of time.
I told you.
This has been great. You told me.
You need to do it 2 parts. I told you.
Thanks a lot, Saul. I
Sure.
really appreciate it.